Hello, hello, good people. Welcome to FinServ Now, presented by CIFS. This is so exciting that you're here. I see people streaming in, so keep coming on in. I am your host, Zakia Larry. Now, I have something incredibly special for you today. If you are a member of CIFS or if you've attended any of our national expos, you know that this is where major players from across the FinServ industry come and share insight and best practices. And so no matter where you are in your career journey, no matter your specific field of endeavor in the FinServ industry, we can all learn from each other because at some point it intersects. So with that being said, today I'm super excited. It's absolutely amazing because we're in a season where a lot of you are looking to stabilize and others are even seeking to grow in this space. And that seems daunting because of the environment that we're in economically. But here's the thing. This industry is vast and yet interconnected, like I shared. So today we are talking to Marcus Stewart. He's the managing partner of Dav4ward Capital, and he's going to illuminate how to finance your future, your entrepreneurial endeavors, while also leveraging your current experience. Now, he has a depth and breadth of knowledge in acquisitions, and he has a past working with top-level financial institutions. He's also the director of the Master of Science in Finance STEM program at the prestigious Bauer College of Business at the University of Houston. All this means is that he is incredibly busy, incredibly awarded, and so we're excited to be able to eke out a bit of time with him today. So if you would please welcome Marcus Stewart to FinServ Now today. Hi, how are you?
Hello, hello. Happy to be here.
Awesome. We're super happy to have you. Thank you for meshing us in here because I know time is of a premium, but so is your brilliance. So we want to get all up in the brilliance today, sir.
Well, we appreciate being able to chime in and sharing you guys' brilliance. So.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Now, Marcus, you have almost 20 years of experience, and that includes advisory, banking, industry roles. And just so people know, it's really important that you've held positions at DuPont, ExxonMobil. I mean, the list goes on and on. But your specialty is oil and gas services, chemicals, and you have, well, an international M&A actually. And so you've been involved in transactions across the energy and chemicals value chain with an aggregated value of over $3 billion. So, Marcus, that's incredible. And so I wanted to first open this conversation with a very general question. We really want to know more about you and your experience. So with that being said, you come from the financial sector of the industry. What initially inspired your interest in the financial services industry as a whole, but specifically your work in asset management and investment banking? Why'd you start there? Why were you interested?
Well, I think, coming from a technical background, engineering background, much of what we do requires financing of equipments, of assets, of some of which are very large and very capital intensive. And so the short answer is there became, and there typically becomes, or not uncommonly becomes, an interest in influencing, participating in, helping to develop access to capital so that you can make some of those technical goals and dreams come true. So it becomes, even if you just sort of connect the dots from budgeting at processing plants, all of that requires capital. So that becomes a linkage there.
That makes sense, and it's very strategic. So I'll say this to our audience here: if you have a question for Marcus Stewart about his experience, about our topic today, please drop that in the chat box, and I will make sure that we loop this into the conversation. We're all one big family here. And so, Marcus, thank you for sharing that. That's an incredible strategic insight about how and why you got started, because it always starts with your why. That's what I always say, right? And so, with your extensive experience in private equity and even with venture capital funds, and we're going to get to that in a moment, so don't feel pressured to talk about that right now. I'm just setting up context for our audience here. I would love to know your thoughts, pulling from that area. Here's what I mean. Right now, multiple industries are reeling from the effects of shutdowns because of COVID-19. And so, like a domino effect, one sector's experience affects the other. And you gave us a bit of a view into that and how the interconnectivity of the industry drove your passion. But we're still interconnected in our day-to-day. And so, what's your forecast when it comes to funding assets, especially large assets? Do you have a forecast on how the banking industry is impacted and how that would impact the viewers who may finance large commercial projects as well? Because we have some real estate folks listening. Do you have a forecast with how banking is shifting in this environment as well, and funding?
Well, I'm always careful about forecasts, but I will say that there's always two sides of a coin, or quite typically, right? And what I mean by that is that when one industry is down or depressed, that's very typically an indicator that another industry is, for lack of a better phrasing, booming. Okay, so good example. If you're moving household goods right now during COVID-19, you're moving groceries. You're doing well. And so during any crisis, there are opportunities operate for luxury goods and commercial space from a real estate standpoint. Commercial space, retail space has been hit very hard now. Right? Everyone's working remotely. Sales in your favorite department stores depressed. But on the counter of that, if you're looking to finance remote video streaming apps like those that we're using, then there's opportunities there. So it's just about, from a financial standpoint, if you're industry agnostic, which many of us are not, but if you are, or if you can be nimble enough to finance across industries, then there's opportunities there. And so, and reality is some of that, and it's that we're involved on the logistics side as well. So some of that manifests itself in just moving goods. So if you're moving tissue paper right now, your business may have never been better. Right? And so it's just around perspective and looking at it, and where you can be in the value chain.
That's very helpful. And one of the perspectives that you shared that gave me an aha moment, even though it seems very straightforward, is that when one industry is down, or when one sector of the industry is down, there's one that's booming. I think the assumption is when one sector is down, everything's down and everyone is trying to scramble to get back to normal. So that's great perspective, because it gives people a new direction to look in. So to that point, then let's talk about pivot. because there are people watching who say, okay, those are, those are great ideas. That's a great example of people who are booming during this time. Let's make this one personal first before we get that brilliant advice from you. In what ways have you had to pivot your business during this climate? Now, I know you've recently stepped into logistics. So was that a business move, or was that in response to the climate? And then if you don't mind dovetailing into other ways you've had to pivot as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, it was a long-term strategic, the logistics move, the long-term strategic play. We have been, though, from a strategic planning standpoint, we were very focused on the industry that I am much more familiar with, and that is energy, and more specifically, oil and gas, and more specifically, upstream, E&P, exploration, production, to some extent, services. And so there's been a confluence of sort of negative dynamics for that industry. And it doesn't always get fully appreciated, because it's not as if there's tons of sympathy out there for the upstream oil and gas space always. But for those folks in the upstream oil and gas space, oil is not always trading at $80, $90, $100 a barrel. Okay, and of course the headlines just several weeks ago was that oil was free, right? And that was because the futures market that was effectively, and we won't get into contango and backwardation, but looking at the NYMEX strip of crude, people were effectively paying you to take oil off their hands, right? Which that becomes a storage dynamic. I have a gluttony of a commodity, and I need to store it somewhere. And so for us, with the pandemic and with the other sort of geopolitical and international dynamics that impact the upstream oil and gas space, clearly oil prices upstream are very, very depressed. One might say, oh, well, wow, that's great, because on the other side of that coin are refineries, right, that utilize that crude and for feedstock. But the demand, particularly because of the pandemic, the demand being depressed as well, was just sort of hitting everybody. So it was really a perfect storm. So to answer your question, that caused us to, particularly on the logistics side, to think less about moving oil and gas assets, and more about moving assets across various sectors, and one of which,
you know what, Marcus, I would love
includes construction.
No, that's so good, because you just gave me an aha moment, and I want to live in that space with you for a minute. You said to focus less about moving oil and gas and shift to moving other products. And then you said more specifically, it was what?
Construction, maybe different types of manufacturing. One of the things that I try to do, and I think many of us try to do, is sort of connect dots, right? So industries have more in common than they have not, right? And
Yes.
So I know that many of your audience is very interested in real estate, and I think I mentioned to you that at its core, oil and gas space upstream is a real estate play, right? It's just mineral rights versus surface rights, and we sever those rights. And then on the logistics side, storage is a real estate play, right? To a large extent. So, but to answer your question again, it's just trying to be able to have flexibility and cover the needs of various sectors, and that's what we try to do.
That is so brilliant. So you essentially boiled down or rather, you took the how you do a thing and you broadened the what. So instead of focusing on moving oil, it's about oil and gas, it's about oil and gas, you broadened your view and said, really what we do is move. these assets, we move these materials, and so you were able to then diversify by thinking in that way. Is that a good way to sort of sum a piece of that up? Because I think that's very helpful for people here.
Right, it's important to the robustness of your business model. To make a comment that many in the real estate space again can appreciate is real estate is a commodity in and of itself, right? And so commodity market dynamics are very heavily supply demand driven, and so oil and gas, which are commodity chemicals, so when the market's depressed, that's an opportunity to buy. Right? And so, and from a financial standpoint, if we can price that in with some kind of consistency, then that becomes an opportunity, and setting the right risk factors and discount rates and what have you. The problem is when you have so much uncertainty, like you don't know where to, in oil and gas lingo, price an asset at $40 a barrel, or price it at $10 a barrel, or $60 a barrel. So you just want to have some control on some of the volatility, which you don't have control on the volatility. So
right, sure. This is good stuff. And what you're sharing leads us into our first audience question. And by the way, guys, please drop your questions in the chat box, because as you see, there's a lot of cross-pollination of incredible ideas here. But our first audience question, Marcus, what is the biggest mistake that you see people make which causes them to unintentionally limit their business? Ooh, so let's tap into your entrepreneurship mind there, sir. What is the biggest mistake that you see people make which causes them to unintentionally limit their business?
I think that they have a too narrow of a view on their market reach. So, I mean, if I appreciate you narrowing the question down to causes them to limit their business. And so I look at it from a top end standpoint, marketing wise, revenue streams. People tend not to sort of connect the dots or look at the mix of fixed and variable costs that might be necessary to pivot their business model slightly or tweak their business model slightly to create an access to a different market. So using a chemical analogy, if I have a batch product and I'm selling this chemical to X, Y, and Z, and I have some other waste product that I'm just throwing out the back door, if I were to use that waste product and add it to a portion of the batch, perhaps I could create a product that would be in high demand for a completely different market. And so oftentimes we don't see those opportunities.
Very good. And thank you so much for that question. And thank you so much, Marcus, for answering that. Before I go back to our list, let's continue exploring your entrepreneurial mind. Someone asks, we have another audience question. If someone is struggling right now, what is one thing I can do to change my trajectory? So this is an entrepreneurship question. They're struggling right now. And is there one key piece of advice or one first step they can take to change their trajectory?
Well, I think there's probably a lot, and without realizing, I think focusing on what you can, probably sounds cliche-ish, what you can control and what you cannot.
Okay.
And so identifying, literally writing down those things, maybe the things that impact your business. So, in oil and gas, for example, we realize that things that you can control and things that you cannot. For example, things that really impact your upstream extraction, if you will, is geology. We know we cannot control the geology. Pricing. We know we can understand the geology, pricing. We cannot control the pricing. It's a commodity, right? If you're a real estate person, you really cannot control the pricing of a dollar per square foot. Engineering, we can control, right? And so just recognizing, what you can control and what you can understand, and focusing on that. I think the other thing is networking with and I know many of your audience already, they do this already, networking with a purpose, and specifically listening and understanding, and then maybe connecting the dots between individuals that are in certain spaces, and perhaps can give you some insight into some opportunities.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that. So, audience, if you have questions for Marcus Stewart about entrepreneurship, pivot, his experience across different sectors of the financial services industry, drop those questions in the chat box and you are part of this conversation. So, Marcus, thank you for that. And of course, we're talking about pivot. You're giving phenomenal advice. Here's my question. As people are thinking about pivoting, people are working on it, in your experience, how would one know if the pivot they're attempting is, one, successful, or two, complete? Is it even possible to know that definitively?
If it's successful or is it complete? I mean, I guess it comes down to how you look at destinations, and whether or not you get philosophical around it being a destination or a journey. I think that if you are, I will answer it in this way. If you are growing, then you have a level of uncomfortableness. And we tend to think that because we're uncomfortable, something's not going well. So if you're pivoting, and particularly depending upon how strong a pivot you're making, but you have a level of growth, you're going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. And I think the key is to get outside of your bubble at times and ask others what they see, and likely they see something you don't. And I always try to focus on my blind spot. We have blind spots, plural sometimes, and if you can network and interface with and have conversations very deliberately around items that you may be missing or things you're not seeing, and a lot of times they'll let you know, hey, you're going in the right direction. And the short answer to your question is perhaps, if you can, ask others that have been there before, and then you realize, wait a minute, this pain is part of this pivot, and so yeah, it's okay.
This pain is part of this pivot. That's profound. Thank you for that. And I love a good alliteration too. And so that's what folks are doing here today. This is so exciting because they get a chance to ask folks who have been there, people like you. So thank you. So as the questions are being dropped in the chat box, I would love, speaking of pivot, I'd love to pivot the conversation to another part of your experience, Marcus. Now, today we said we're going to talk about financing your entrepreneurial endeavors. And so a lot of folks now are looking toward entrepreneurship, or a lot of people watching are already entrepreneurs. And obviously financing those endeavors are critical to them. What are two key ways entrepreneurs can begin to seek that funding for their entrepreneurial endeavors?
Well, one is the forecast. You mentioned like forecasting with a financial or even economic model, from revenue to cost to understanding gross margins, understanding EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation. Just or even if you are not and I always try to impart this to whomever I'm speaking to and students or what have you. There were people who've been very successful in business without all these fancy degrees, right? And sometimes it's just arithmetic, okay? And then sometimes it's just arithmetic and very sound arithmetic and just continuing to sort of iterate around that, right? And so have a forecast, and with the forecast and in the economic components of that forecast in terms of revenue and your costs, allow you to pick apart each element of the cash flow and question each element of the cash flows. Where am I sensitive to cost movement? What costs can I control and what costs might I not control? The other thing related to that is sensitivities. Run sensitivities around what happens if my move by 10, 20%. What does that do to my margins? And then when you have those conversations with potential investors, have conversations with the vernacular that speaks to their currencies. Right? Pay back in these number of months, this kind of return, these kind of margins, and that will get people's attention.
Gotcha. That's very helpful. And remember, guys, drop your questions for Marcus in the chat box because we are landing the plane here. We're almost out of time. But while we have you here, Marcus, I have a couple more questions. So that was really insightful. And one of the things that I happen to know about you, and it's also in your bio, that you do extensive work with VC firms, venture capital firms. And for a lot of entrepreneurs, that just seems like a big, scary world, hard to break into. How do you even get funding? How do you even get on the radar? How do our entrepreneurs start to and this is, give us the entry level. How do they find the door to knock on, and how do you get interest from those VC firms? Do you have to like invent the next Tesla or something?
Well, I again, at the risk of using a cliche, there are levels. That's right. And so
Okay.
one thing is to recognize that you don't have to be at sort of a venture capital level or have a conversation with venture capitalists in the Bay Area or Boston or what have you in some of those hotbeds. Recognizing that there are venture capitalists where you live, right? And the other thing is that before you get to more institutionalized venture capital funding, recognize that there are what many of you have heard, angel investors, right? Seed investors, without getting into more elaborate sort of Series A, Series B sort of vernacular. And there are very early stage sort of friends and family. There are high net worth individuals, many of who qualify as sort of really accredited investors, and so have the conversations around, and you won't be able to get there by being shy, but have the conversations around accessing individuals that have capital that they want to put to work, and recognize that they may have an appetite for a certain level of alternative investments, which is what we're talking about. Venture capital sort of falls into, and early stage entrepreneurial financing sort of falls into an alternative investments, alternative to sort of your typical sort of securities or what have you. So, making those contacts, having those conversations, developing those relationships. Very, there's no shortcut around that. Unfortunately, or fortunately for some, some people have more access to those individuals than others. Some have more access to a variety of capital sources than others, but you can seek out those investors.
That's very powerful. You mentioned something, and we have another chat box question, but before we get to that, and that's going to be our last question, my question is, you mentioned there are angel investors, venture capitalists, where you live in your backyard. How do you find those people? Is there a resource that you recommend? And even if you don't have that in front of you today, we can send it out to our viewers here. But I just wanted to ask, well, how do you find those folks right where we live?
Well, in some ways, it's a lot easier than it used to be, right? In terms of just, literally internet searches. There are local chapters of varieties of organizations. You can see if there are angel funds where you're located. You can see there are seed capital sources, and now, particularly because of the Jobs Act and whatnot, you have just so many other avenues that were not available to folks not that long ago, crowdfunding and what have you. And so literally there are searches that aside from tapping into your network and but some of the searches, and we can circle back in terms of some of the journals and organizations that that'll make that available and accessible to people.
Awesome, thank you for that. So we can start out with angel investors in Dallas and start to do some research there on Google, right? And then, sure, like Mr. Stewart said, we'll circle back with a couple of tips. And it's amazing because as I was asking you that, someone said, how do you suggest we go about locating our local angel, seed, and venture capital investors? So yeah, there you go. And we'll circle back as well. So thank you for touching on that, Marcus. And our last question, chat box. Our chat box is active. Thank you, guys. Took the pressure off of my list that I have over here. So our last question here, Marcus, is when businesses have a downturn like right now, most businesses cut things that create the differentiators between them and their competitors, such as training and marketing. Is this wise? Ooh.
It may sound it may sound unpopular, which is oftentimes my answers to questions are unpopular. And I also hate to have answer with it depends, right? But oftentimes if you have a plan to adjust to that, then it may be the answer to surviving, right? I mean, there's oftentimes there's no substitute for cutting costs, but if those things really added value, then you're not looking to cut them long term, right? You're looking to take a hiatus on these costs, and oftentimes, particularly, I'd like to believe that such that those costs are sort of personnel and whatnot, then you and those individuals are talented, then you just reroute those efforts in another direction. Okay, so in a perfect world, you don't cut as much as you just reallocate. So in other words, if they to use a analogy that we can relate to here in the Gulf Coast, if the hurricane is coming and the windows are already blown, let's just, instead of allocating resources to guarding the windows, let's go ahead and just focus on the roof.
Got it. Thank you for that. And let me make sure I got everyone in the chat box here. We got it. Oh my goodness. And we ended right at our time. So Marcus Stewart, managing partner of Dav4ward Capital, giant in your industry. We really, really appreciate you taking time out, spending time with us here on FinServ Now. Thank you for answering our questions. Do you have just a closing thought just to send us out into the world with today, having spent time with you, about pivot or entrepreneurship as we land this plane?
I would simply say, and this is something that you develop over time, right? Even the time that's been on the street in New York, Wall Street, is be prepared to be unprepared, and have passion. I would leave you with a few P's, right? Passion, performance, preparation, process.
Mm.
That's actually part of the mantra to Dav4ward, is that we like to focus on 4 P's: processing, passion, performance, preparation. So
And there you have it, folks. We will take that with us. And thank you so much for joining us today, Marcus. And we hope you continue to elevate and have a phenomenal day.
thank you so much for having me.
The pleasure is all mine. My amazing attendees and family here, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. Remember that we will be having these compelling conversations the third Tuesday of every single month. So make sure you sign up for next month. counselforinclusion.org/FinServ-now. This is so good. I'll see you guys in 1 month. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you.
Bye.